what they often remember about me, is the idea that when you're a specialist, you need to learn to communicate like a generalist. Your authority is not going to come from going through the detail. It's going to come from going through the detail and explaining it and helping other people interpret it. So bring people along in the story.
I'm super excited to sit down with Nancy Dynan, who I've had the opportunity to get to know both on a professional and personal level over the years. She's an accomplished executive with an impressive track record of leading and transforming consumer brands in the outdoor and active lifestyle industry. Nancy's expertise spans over 2 decades, where she has successfully overhauled company strategies, developed top-tier executive teams, and enhanced marketing and GTM processes for brands such as LL Bean, prAna, and NIXON. Nancy, welcome to the Outdoor Industry Executive Voices podcast.
Thanks, Tony. Nice to be here.
I'm really glad to have you. Nancy, I got to start here. As a lifelong competitive rower and coach, what surprises or unexpected developments have you observed in this year's Olympic rowing events?
Oh, wow. I have to admit, I haven't been following them as closely as I usually do. So I think that the only surprise for me is that there's been actually a relative lack of coverage. I feel like coming out of a time when we just had boys in the boat and there's so many Americans faring well, I haven't seen that much coverage.
That's interesting. I feel the same way. And I guess from your standpoint, knowing what these athletes are up against, what are they feeling before these events?
Oh, just in some ways, they're so happy to be there. I think sometimes we forget when you're watching the Olympics and we're rooting for people to get a gold medal or silver medal. Just getting through the trials and just getting there is such a big accomplishment. And I have a lot of friends who've been to the Olympics and they talk about that moment you get there to the village, get to your compound where you're going to be staying, and the thrill of actually finally making it a childhood dream. And then, of course, there's race days, and they know that they have to come through a lot of heats and semis to get there. And it just you take on one at a time. And if you're lucky enough to get to the final, it's the same way I race, which is one stroke at a time. And eventually millimeters add up to centimeters and centimeters add up to meters. And that's how you win.
One stroke at a time. So that's interesting. It's a good segue to taking ownership of one's career path. We'll talk specifically about you. What are some of the key moments that led you to realize finding the right company was essential? And then how did you take control of that journey once you got there?
It's interesting. I've been reflecting a lot about that, especially preparing for this podcast. And I grew up in a generation where, or at least a family, I'm not sure I can speak for an entire generation, where really the expectation was to go to college for 4 years and get out and get a job. And a job was putting on a suit and earning an income so that you could enable a lifestyle that you wanted. But you didn't necessarily overlap where you worked with who you were. Work wasn't necessarily an identity. And so my first couple of positions, first 2 jobs out of college were a little bit by luck and didn't think a lot about the industry I was going into. And first job I'll say the first place I lived was in Dallas. And I got there on a bet. My boyfriend and I, from college, I was probably spending a little too much rowing, yet I still bet him that whoever got the job first, that's where we'd live. And I was pretty sure I'd win that. And I lost. And I ended up in Dallas, Texas, where I really didn't know anybody and didn't have a job. And I wanted to get a job pretty quickly. And I answered a newspaper ad for a marketing job at the Hochschild Collection, which is a company that was later bought by Neiman Marcus while I was there. And it's a kind of home decor. I was way too young to be worrying about home decor. But most importantly, it was a marketing job in a catalog company at the time, before we had the internet. And it combined qualitative and quantitative skills, which really was my what I excelled at. And from there, I moved to a job in Colorado, and Colorado was much more my lifestyle. That's where I feel like I grew to be an adult. And my then husband at the time and I actively hiked and lived and skied. And he worked for U.S. Cycling as part of NORBA, which is National Off-Road Bicycling Association. And so we had this really robust outdoor life. Started a family there. We loved the outdoors. Yet I was working for a greeting card company. And I just didn't make the connection that I could be much happier if I could align who I was as a person with where I was working. And I still think that idea was relatively new. And then one day I saw another ad, and sorry, Tony, for your business, but this is how I found jobs for a long time, was through ads. in the old days for a job at LL Bean. And at the time, I was more connected to going to Bean because if I was going to be in the catalog business, the direct mail business, I wanted to be at the best. I wanted to go to the show. I wanted to be where I could learn the best skills possible. And I was still missing that connection that, oh boy, can you connect that lifestyle and who you are? And it was really when I got to Bean and I really saw what LL Bean did to retain employees by building a culture and a lifestyle, the value system. So it's all about getting outdoors. And that is how I was living, that I realized that, boy, you can get a lot more out of yourself personally in your career, but as an employer, you can also get a lot more out of your people if you actually align those two. And that's where I really first started thinking, I don't want to just work for a really great brand. I want to work for a brand that really aligns with who I am.
When we think about lessons that we learn along this path that we're on, I'm curious to learn from you, what are some of the pivotal lessons then as you started with LL Bean and to obviously where you are today? What are some of the pivotal lessons that shaped your career? And maybe to go a little bit deeper, Nancy, is maybe you can tell me a little bit about what experiences have truly defined your approach to leadership from those lessons.
Yeah. I'll talk a lot about LL Bean because I was there for 16 years. I've been gone for almost 14. When I speak about LL Bean, it was the Bean I was at, and I can't speak to what it's like now. But when you're at a company that long, you really have to look and realize that is the foundation of who you are. That is where I learned so many of the lessons that were foundational to where I've gone since then. And probably, as I just mentioned, LL Bean was really smart about how it approached its employees. And so what they said to me when I got there is they say, look, we relocate a lot of people into Maine to work for LL Bean. And that's a big lifestyle change for families, especially I was bringing a young child and a husband. And there's not a lot of, at that time, there was not a lot of other options in Maine. So if you were going to move on from Bean, it was going to be another move for the family. So Bean really took this perspective that we want to keep you at the company. And this was really smart in terms of employee retention, employee happiness, but super smart from a company's perspective too, that they just kept investing in training and career development over and over. And so that they weren't having this constant loss of knowledge. And instead they were grooming and training their own future leaders. And so some of the ways they did that, the first lesson I learned, and I still think it's a really valuable lesson to me, and I've used it in companies I've gone to since, is that I'm going to speak specifically within marketing, which is my background, this idea of being a generalist versus a specialist. And so at Bean, they really had you move around to different functions in marketing pretty much every 2 years. And I said, don't worry so much about the first part of your title, whether you're a manager or senior manager or director, that's going to come naturally. Worry about the second half of your title. What are you doing? I'm the manager of email, and now I'm the manager of catalog operations, and now I'm the site manager. And each time you're learning more and more, and you're really making your own map bigger so that when it comes time to advance, you've had that experience, that really broad experience. And as a company, what you're getting out of it, and I really was, as I became more senior, was the instigator of continuing this at Bean, was that you get a fresh perspective on each discipline every time you bring someone new in. So it's like a crazy recipe that you're putting together. So you're like, what if I take the person that's in charge of public relations and put them in charge of SEO? That's probably an extreme, or merchandising. Well, really interesting with that because the PR person really has this great connection to the outside and trends going on and what people are responding to. And so then when they get over to merchandising, they have this really curious, interesting background. And the merchandiser, let's say, goes in the PR and they know about the products and development in the last 3 or 4 years. And so I think moving around that way within a company is a really smart way of retaining people. And I really think broad background that I had ultimately paid off when I got to be more senior and was managing entire groups. About a year ago, I was sitting down with an employee and she wanted to do changing a relationship or a vendor, and we need to take a look at our privacy policy. And I said, she said, I don't know if we can do this or not. I said, let's take a look at the privacy policy. And we start reading through it. And she's like, how do you know this stuff? I'm like, because at one crazy point at LOB, they put me in charge of the privacy policy and I had to learn it. I never raised my hand for that. I didn't want it, but it was part of this mentality of becoming a generalist.
Speaking of the generalist, right? And we think about generalist versus specialist. And it's something I find myself having this conversation frequently that in my line of work, oftentimes I'm going after the specialist. And I'm a huge believer in generalist or the Swiss Army knife, a jack of all trades. But you crossed over through multiple areas, but then ultimately you are a specialist. And I'm just curious, early on, you avoided the specialist trap by learning these different components of the business. But have you ever navigated the balance between, we'll call it specialization and versatility, specifically in your career? And if you have, or when you have, what advice would you give to others that really, they might be facing this dilemma right now as they listen to this?
Yeah. And, it's funny. I am a generalist and it was a forced generalization, which I'm really glad about. I think I have tendencies to being a specialist myself. I like going deep. I always tell people, I'm going to go really deep when I first meet you or come to a new company, but then I'll get out of it because I need the security and I need to really understand things. But one of the tasks, and I remember the day it occurred to me, is I was just in myself in my career making a move from being kind of a specialist in the sense that I need to prove to you that I know what I'm doing. I need to show that I have authority, to being a more generalist. And I was going through some marketing plans with a senior team, and suddenly I get my boss steps on my toe under the table. And I'm like, what the? Oops, sorry. And I realized, so I shift my approach and we continue the meeting. And afterwards, I'm like, hey, what was that about? He goes, sometimes you don't want to get into the details. And now today's the day you got to learn how to get out of the details. And so that's where I began to think very differently about communication. And I think that this is where, if people talk to me, that's what they often remember about me, is the idea that when you're a specialist, you can be a specialist, but you need to learn to communicate like a generalist. And what do I mean by that? That your authority is not going to come from going through the detail and proving the detail. Your authority is going to come from going through the detail and explaining it and helping other people interpret it. So bring people along in the story. So I always give specialists, especially need this coaching. And I say, hey, you're going to make the biggest impression for yourself and your career, but also be the biggest contributor to the company if you follow this. You get this enormously complicated forecasters or test results or something you got to explain. Stay away from acronyms, specialty, words people don't understand. That may seem important to you, but people are just going to stop listening as soon as you hear those. Start with setting the context. This is so basic. Start with setting the context. Why are we here today? We're here to look at the forecast, blah, blah, blah. What do we know? Help them understand what it is. Use really basic language and really great charts to show them. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. And that's when you begin the conversation. These are the assumptions we have to make today. Here are some options. And this is where I think the specialist and especially people coming up in their career make the mistake is they don't bring options. And then the very hardest thing to do, but I think it's what I look for when I'm looking for people to advance, is what is the recommendation? And I remember so well when I was younger and I was first starting at Neiman Marcus, and my boss training me goes, that's really interesting and great interpretation, but what should we do? And I was thinking, I'm 22 years old. I don't know. You've been in business 20 years. You tell me. He said, no, that's your job. Your job's not to read that data. Your job's not to write the summary. It's to make a recommendation. And I think that's the moment of real bravery. I think that's the moment where you really jump the abyss into becoming a successful contributor at a senior level at a company.
That's a really solid approach. You don't just present the information or even what you're responsible for. You conclude that with the recommendation as part of it or at the conclusion of it. And that, that I think that really can help people that are sitting around in that meeting, who maybe it is some of it's going over their head or maybe not, but they at least see this is their position. And ultimately, that's what some of the best leaders that I'm sure you've had exposure to and I have, is they can put a flag in the ground to get people to rally around it. And it's not necessarily this is it. It's about this is the recommendation after they learn or they have exposure to all the information, and they can offer that as a next step.
I think that as a boss and a mentor, manager, the moment that I can see my team doing it it's just so easy for me to then reach out and help them up when they really nail the ability to come out of their expertise and share and communicate with others outside their expertise. At the moment, I feel like, yes, come along with me. We can be, much more impactful as a team together.
You think about building the right team. I'm curious to get your perspective and your recommendation is, what have you found to be the most crucial factors in assembling a successful team? And have you had any missteps that you've learned from while doing so?
I think building a team is the most important part of a senior leader's job. You can only advance yourself if your team is strong. And I feel that a good significant portion of your job should be about building that team below you. The successful parts of a team to me is that the number one team aspect is that there has to be a sense of camaraderie and a team. This comes from my sports background, I think. But this idea that we're working for a common goal, we're not working against each other, we're not working at odds, we're not competing, we are the team competing against the outside. And so that's a real hard thing to do. And from your work is finding out, is this person going to fit and how are they going to contribute to the team? Because the downside of that is that you don't want groupthink. You don't want to hire a bunch of people that are just like you. You actually want to hire the perfect complements to each other. And so how do you hire that team that's balanced? So when I hire, I bring people in and we do all sorts of panel interviews. We do an assignment, try to get people into not just an interview mode, because no one is really themselves in interview mode, but can we give them a project, stick them in a staff meeting as though they're part of the staff and just see how they interact. The second most important part of team for me is the ability to take strategic plans and make them operational plans. And so many companies out there get a great strategy in place, and then it just sits on a shelf. And to me, a strategy is only as good as the operational plans. So if I get a strategy in place, and it's my job to make sure it's clear and it's not a kitchen sink of ideas, things have been prioritized, this is what the vision is, it's my job as a senior leader to say it over and over. But for my staff, let's say you're the head of sales, I need you to take it and be able to slice it down and say, okay, now in the next 12 months, this is what we're going to get done. This is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to measure it. And here I'm going to share my operating plan with the head of marketing and the head of product to make sure that we're all working towards the same thing. And that ability to have that plan in place, then when things get thrown at you last minute, something you didn't expect, business conditions go up, business conditions go down, you can go into that operating plan and say, hey, I'm going to slow down this work, or I'm going to reprioritize this. But your ability to grow and achieve what you need to achieve in your strategic plan is only as good as the daily roadmap you set. And that includes measurement, because I think it's really important. Everyone wants the sense that they're accomplishing something. So how does your team know that they're doing well and doing what they're supposed to, especially in challenging times when maybe the sales aren't coming in? We're in a tough time right now, and maybe sales aren't going up all the time. And what you can't let is your team go mood-wise up and down by sales. Are there other metrics? One thing I learned at LLB is that people will only come in the door so long just to drive revenue, just to drive growth. That gets some people excited, but most people, they're there to do something bigger. And so we used to translate it into customers. And so instead of talking about sales growth, how many customers do we want us to buy from us this year? How many customers do we want to get in the outdoors? More importantly, how many customers do we want to come back? Did we make them so happy that they'll come back again and again? And that became a really easy, universal discussion, like with the retail stores. You had this many customers in yesterday. Can you get one more of them to buy? Can you get one more to leave happy? And so with your leadership team, are you getting the right measures in place so that you can really track progress, but you could also motivate your staff?
Is there a specific framework that you were educated on, or is this all foundation that came from LL Bean?
I'd say most of what I learned in the field. I have a liberal arts degree. I didn't really know what I wanted to do after college. What I was lucky is I had a lot of good leaders. And I really think one of the most important parts of growth is not just what you're being actively taught, but what you passively observed. And so There was a lot of time spent looking at, hey, what worked? Why is that leader having success? Why is that leader not having success? It's one of the things that, and this is obviously a controversial issue about in the office or not in the office. And I think it's up to every company and every job to decide. But I'll say for me in my development, the passive observation of what leaders were doing, what was working and what wasn't working was probably 80% of my education.
Interesting. As I'm listening to you right now, I'm actually reading a book or listening to the book on Audible, and it's called Traction. And it's a book about EOS, which is the Entrepreneurial Operating System. On my beach walk this morning, 3 things that you had just listed that you do are part of the Entrepreneurial Operating System, or as it's the acronym is EOS. I was curious if was there a book or a framework or a training? And it sounds like you said it's all been on the job as you have gone along, learning the things that do work or in regards don't work.
Yeah.
When I think about how many teams that you have built, and I'm curious, just from your perspective, when you have made a hire, but then you've realized maybe it's early on, maybe it's 6 months on into the hire that you've made, that we'll just call it what it is, a bad hire. Has there been any situation like that you experienced that taught you what to do when that situation happens?
Yeah, and I've been on all sides of that. This is why I think the hiring process needs to be really thorough. And so let me talk about that half of it first, of how I prevent it. On one half is I think that you have to be, as a hiring manager or a hiring company, you have to be really honest and open with the candidate. It is as much their decision to come to you as your decision to hire. And so you need to realize that it's not going to work if they don't thoroughly understand what it's like to work in the company. And as I mentioned before, I think getting someone in, meeting all the team members, the panel, putting them in a real life situation where they're presenting information and they're in a discussion with the people they're going to be with is all super important. And I always have said, and this is at all the companies I've been working at, as soon as I agree to an employee, I walk around the building, I say, this is it. It is what it is. Start thinking now. I mean, can you envision yourself here? And so very much, I think the candidates can self-select out fairly fast if you are completely honest with what it's like. The other thing I think it's really important is I want to talk about when candidates come in and what I quietly coach candidates I'm hiring, but I'll especially coach them if I'm mentoring or working with someone who's looking at a job and they're worried about fit, is that before you walk in the door of interviewing, before you talk to a recruiter, you need to do your own work to figure out what is the criteria of the company you want to work for. And this is something that after I was at All Bean, I did this wild leap, went into the wash, just big change in my life. I moved to London and I worked for a fashion brand for 2.5 years. And it was great. It was hard, but it was great. It was scary, but it was exciting. And it was just the shakeup I needed to get my brain clear. After you work at a company for 16 years, going to work someplace, new country, new company, new culture, no connections, no network is a great way to figure out, well, what do I really want in a company? And so coming out of Bowdoin, and I wanted to get back into the action sports or outdoor space, I came up with 5 criteria. And the 5 criteria are personal to me, but I often share them to say, hey, then you figure out the 5 criteria. And what I find is people have the buckets I put them in are really relevant. The specifics are not as relevant to everyone. But for me, the first criteria was that I want to work for a brand I believe in. And for me, it means a brand that doesn't just sell stuff. It needs to be doing something bigger contribution to the world. And whether that's through sustainability, innovation, training people, like it needs to be bigger than just selling things. I got to a point in my life where I just want to add more to the world than just putting more stuff out there. Number 2, coming out of all this experience before I got to prAna, was I want a seat at the table. I'd had senior titles before. I'd been vice president. I'd been head of marketing. I'd been all sorts of titles. But did I really have a seat at the table? And what I mean is I want to be a decision maker. I want to be one of the people at the table that can quickly make decisions, because I'd seen companies get stuck on these layers of whose job is that? Who says yes? I wanted to be at the table to make the decision. My 3rd criteria was I want to work for someone I can learn from. And the more senior you go, the harder that gets. And so I really wanted to find a boss where I could still learn. Fourth is I want to like the people I work with. And what that often means is that we need to have shared values and reasons to come to work. And that starts also at the company, what the company values and cultures are. And when you have that joint belief that we're doing something bigger for the world, you really enjoy these people you're working with. And then the fifth criteria was I wanted to be someplace where I love my life. And for me, that's by the beach, access to the outdoors, access to rowing, access to scuba diving. And so where I live is really important to me as well. And so when you have those 5 criteria, then go into the office and then go into the interview, then talk to the recruiter and begin your scorecard. And I can pretty much say with certainty is that if you stray from your criteria, you're not going to be happy. You might be able to gut out a year, 2, 3 years at a company, but if you really want to find the right match, you follow your criteria. And to flip that back to what we're saying is, so I want my candidates to come in and make sure they have criteria so we're a match to begin with. And so if you have that alignment, I've been honest, they know where they are. I think the odds that your team is going to work is really strong. But there's always surprises that will turn up that the person didn't quite have the skills you've looked for. Hopefully you've done enough. You've given them a project and you've brought them to discussion so you've really vetted the skills, but sometimes you don't get it. And that's where you really have to do the honest conversation with the person quickly, that these aren't the right skills, but is there an alternative? Can we narrow down the scope? Can we change the scope? Can we put you on a project or an assignment and just be honest and said, hey, this is not going to work long-term. Maybe this is a 6-month or a 12-month deal, but we'll help you work. But if a person's made the commitment to come to the company, how can you work with them to gracefully exit and move them on to the next? Not being honest and keeping them along too long, they're probably working against those criteria they have for themselves. You're compromising what you want out of the role. You got to keep it moving.
There's a couple of things that you just shared, Nancy, I think are trending back to more on the skills side, and that is evaluating for skills, where I can remember even as far back as 2016 that it felt like my customers, they were looking for people's backgrounds. Who did they work for? And that's great, but that's not the full picture without the skills. One of the components that also, it's something you and I've talked about, is the mission and values. And does that individual align with the mission and values? Because if they don't align really well, it's going to bring everyone down. And that there's nothing, I feel like sitting in a meeting with someone that does not share that same values as the entirety of the business or the executive team, they're just going to pull it down. And that is those 2 pieces right there. It's not everything that makes the stars aligned, but the skills and understanding that they do have them. And then the ability to understand if they do share the mission and values of the organization.
And I think that's tricky also, especially, most recently I was in outdoor space with prAna and then NIXON with Action Sports. And, not mistaking a passion for what you stand for having the values. So just because, so I'll take prAna as a combination of yoga and climbing. Just because you're a climber doesn't necessarily mean you have the values and understand the mission of the company. Just because you skate doesn't mean you necessarily understand the values of NIXON. And so sometimes if you're at a highly specialized company, I'll have someone come in my office and say, oh yeah, well, they do yoga every day. They'll be great. I was like, no, that's not the criteria. Do they believe we can make the world a better place through sustainable products? Knowing yoga, climbing, they're great attributes and increase the likelihood that they're going to share the values, but that in alone is a shortcut and it doesn't always work.
I totally understand what you're saying. And you'd be surprised, but how many people reach out to me for specific opportunities based on what their passion is? That's not the lead in at a senior level, right? That's not, it never grabs my attention when someone says, I'm an active alpine skier and I want to work in the ski industry. It almost makes me become suspicious. What are you truly after from a mission and value standpoint? You've talked to me in the past, but not in any depth. And that was how we think about the guiding principles when you lead a team. You've got some principles or really some rules that you've always used to ensure your team's understood. And can you also tell me how these shaped, how you feel like these specific principles shaped the culture and the success of the teams that you've led?
I do have these 3 rules, and you asked to go deep. They're actually not deep at all. They're super simple. And they've come across them through trial and error. Someone who I worked for at Bean originally planted them in my head. I've gone back to him and said, oh my God, these changed my leadership completely. And he denies that he ever said them. He doesn't remember them.
Okay.
But I think that they were so innate to him, he didn't realize he was imparting wisdom. And so if I say, to start working for me, I said, hey, there's just these 3 rules. If you follow them, everything's always great or always works. And when things break down, you'll figure out is one of these is where we went off. And the first rule is no surprises. So it's a really simple, is that we're a team and we have to have each other's back. So if the website crashes, just give me a shout that the website is down. Don't make me hear it from the private equity group who suddenly noticed it. Or if we're out of this product and anything going on, just, I don't need to know what you're doing about it right now. I trust that you can do it, but just give me a shout. Don't let me learn this from somebody else. And that idea that once we all know, I might say, oh, yeah, I know exactly. Go talk to this person. And this no surprise rule has worked. It's stopped a major fraud that was about to go down because something just seemed fishy. And as soon as I heard what was going on, I was like, stop immediately. That's fraud. It has allowed me to build trust that, look, I'm not going to lose myself if I hear this is going on. I'm actually here to help you. And it's allowed us to address things a lot faster. And I love no surprises. The second rule is one voice. And this can be sometimes controversial and misunderstood. But with a team or with a department, let's get behind closed doors and we can argue all we want about something. I want to hear your opinion. We're going to go back and forth. I'm going to listen to everybody. We're going to decide together. But when we walk out of the room, it's one voice. You have one message, especially if you're coming out of a marketing team. You don't want the meeting to leave and then you head over to product and you said, yeah, I heard that project was tanking. When the truth is that it dipped last week and now it was back up. You don't want to disseminate all this bad information. And so one voice is really important. And then as you get to an executive team, again, you're your first team. And so find a way to say it so that you all leave the meeting and everyone can understand the direction you're going to. Don't cause confusion by saying it differently. And then the third rule is one plate of work. So we're all in it together. Again, we're as a team. My pet peeve is when people say, oh, I didn't get my work done because so-and-so didn't do this. No, we're trying to do this together. It's a common goal. So if this group isn't getting it done, go over and say, well, how can I help? How can we speed this up? What can my team do to help your team? It's one accomplishment. So we're not separate islands. And no surprises, one voice, one plate of work. And you'll find that 99% of the time that the whole team follows those rules, you get a lot done.
I love that. I hope people adopt that after listening to this because that is so straightforward. It's very simple. It's logical. One voice, one plate of work, and no surprises. That's
and people come back now all the time and talk about, wow, that was really good. And so I work it that way. It's funny. My kids now have brought that into work, their workplaces. And they're like, wow, it works here too. I'm like, yeah, it's universal.
So as you're raising your children, was that a household rule also? Or was that a guiding principle?
Certainly works. So no surprises would certainly work. Me and my kid's father, I certainly use the one voice and it's super important. And one plate of work also works. You're a family unit. It's the first unit. And so, how are you helping each other today? I will say last night, my son texted me. He's in support for a third-party provider. And I don't talk to him that much, actually. He's very independent. Maybe only texts me once or twice a week. And something was going down at work. He was working a help desk and he recognized that a major client late at night was having trouble getting on. And the protocol called for them to just delay the call till the morning staff gets there. And he used the no surprise work. He said, this is too big for me not to go up the chain. And he finally found the team through Teams, the head of operations of his company and said, hey, I don't know if you need to know this, but this just happened. And it turned out to be a big deal and saved the client. And yeah, that guy did not want to walk in at 9 o'clock this morning and be surprised that this client's been pissed off at you for the last 12 hours.
What a good call. And the fact that he reached out to you. Yes. How old is this one?
He's 30. So he's a pretty big guy. But I said, yeah, that's what you do. That guy did not want to be surprised.
That's awesome. This is no surprise to anyone who's listening. I feel very passionately about this, that the scale of male leadership compared to female leadership in the outdoor active lifestyle, sporting goods industry is it's off balance. It's something I believe we need more of it. I think the industry will progress and grow bigger and better. But something I've known about you is you've always been a master networker. You've been someone who keeps your relationships, you stay in touch with people. And I want to hear about your belief of why it's vital for female leaders to connect and support one another. And then I'm curious to hear from you, because of your networking skills, how that has influenced your career.
Your observation is right. And I don't fully understand, even after all these years, why so much of the action sport and outdoor industry is male dominated at the top. Of course, that's not unique to the industry. And over time, I think I was largely, I didn't notice as much when I was younger. I figured, oh, this is going to fix itself. And then as I became more senior, I was like, well, I don't want to be that type of woman that keeps other women down and there's only one rung at the top. Yet there is still like a large underrepresentation of women. And when I talked to women who worked for me, they wanted to excel, but they weren't always sure how. And there was certainly, I found with women, more lack of confidence in the ability to do new things. And I talked about you should do scary things. Moving to London was super scary. At Albine, I had a lot of lack of confidence, I'll say, crises. Every time I was given a new opportunity, I was like, how in the world? I've never run creative operations before. Why did they ask me to do this? This must be a mistake. Or for a while, I ran a co-branded credit card. I don't know anything about banking. Why am I here? And so there was a lot of self-doubt. And I think that, I don't know where it comes from, but I find it more in women. Yet it's just a temporary state to have that type of self-doubt. So where I've really found it useful is having women in your life who, when you say, I'm nervous or I don't know if I can really do this, you don't feel like you're showing a weakness. You're being honest and another woman can understand. And then help each other, slap them on the back, build them up, go out for a drink, help them cross this gap. And you just have to it's just a little jump. You just have to say, yes, it's going to be scary. Let's go. You can do it. But I find that networking with women, and I have a lot of women that are just slightly younger than me, maybe 5, 10, 15 years, who I'm still in contact now, who really still call me or text me or email. They just need 10 minutes on the phone for me and them to talk through. Yeah, of course you should do this. This is going to be great. You can do it. And I think that kind of having your team, having your go-to confidence builder, having your squad that's going to help you have your back, build you up is super important. And so I don't know how fast we can really change things, but I do feel that when I see a young woman who says, yeah, I want to go further, is kind of make sure I set her up with somebody that she's safe with, that can help her feel confident to take on the next step, to make those scary jumps. Because it's the scary jumps, it's the uncomfortableness that gets you going, that gets you advanced.
Did you have a female mentor, and do you still stay in touch with them?
I can't point specifically to a mentor, a female mentor early on. And then, unfortunately, I think I was part of that generation that really felt there was only ever room for one woman. So there was a bit of isolation at the top. But over time, I actually learned from two groups of people. One was this group of women they're either working for me or had worked for me. It was the younger generation, people that were 10 or 15 years older than me, that really made me understand that what I could do. I had a woman who came in to work for me in LB, and this is one of the reasons I left LB. And she'd been there maybe 2 or 3 months. And you're the best boss I've ever had. You are so smart. You could do so well in the world. You're being held back at LB. And I'm like, what? I love it here. And she goes, you just don't understand how talented you are. And it was really those words. Like, no one had given me those affirmations before. And it was someone who worked for me. It was someone younger than me that really made me realize I could do something more. There was something greater for me. So it's funny that it's not from above. It was from below, a ground surge of people below me pushing me out. And then the other place I got a lot of confidence in mentoring is because I was on a rowing team. And so you mentioned that I actively rowed and competitively raced as a master rower up to about a year ago. And I had been a competitive rower in college. It was before rowing had joined the NCAA, but essentially a Division I school, a top 10 team. And I went back to rowing in my 30s. And over about 5 or 6 years, I kind of came up through rowing, found out that a lot of the stronger rowers, people who got to the national team or the Olympics, had since retired. And so there was like a lot of space at the top of being a competitive rower and could quickly go up, and founded a team of top women and men athletes from all over the country, actually all over the world, that would get together and race, train in Florida in the fall and winter, and then we'd race all over the world. So the other group that's been really influential and supportive of me is with my rowing friends. After being in college, I got back into rowing in my 30s and ended up rowing competitively as a master rower all over the country and all over the world. And as part of that journey, I founded a rowing team with 3 other women. And we ran the team together for 5 years. The team grew to over 150 participants. We won national titles, world titles together. Those were great. Winning is great. Traveling is great. Amazing memories of being in Portugal, racing in New Zealand. But being with strong, successful women, even though they were in totally different lines of work, was also a great way for me to be mentored and supported. And so I could call up a friend of mine who's an emergency room doctor, and she doesn't know much about marketing. I know nothing about emergency room medicine, but we could still support each other and help each other in our decisions.
It's our community, right? It's interesting. Last night I was having a conversation. This individual, he was a president of an apparel company. He just moved his family, and now he's the CFO of a retail apparel company, probably between the premium and luxury. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about mentorship last night, and I gave him some advice that I actually was giving to myself and everyone who's listening right now. One of my closest friends just got married in Ann Arbor back in June. It was a Latin ceremony. It was 2 hours. It was excruciating. But something that the priest said during his homily, I think aligns with mentorship. And he said, I hear people all the time, and they tell me this. They say, as I get older, I don't want to be a burden on my children or anybody. And he said, what he responds every time that comes up, he said it comes up quite frequently. He goes, you are a burden, but you're also a blessing. And so for those who are listening right now, and when you think about your mentor or someone who can be a mentor, and something I shared with this individual yesterday is mentors actually derive a significant amount of fulfillment helping someone. And so by asking that mentor and proactively setting up conversations or coffee dates, or however you guys typically would communicate, like you with your team, my mentor, it took me years to realize that his name is Randy Watson. And Randy loves doing things to help me. But I've always been the kind of person that I'm not good at receiving. I'm probably better at giving. Mm-hmm. And it took me years to realize that he actually derives a great amount of satisfaction by knowing he can impact someone positively. If you're like, Nancy, you've got a team.
So true.
They want to help you. And if you have a mentor and they are engaged with you, it's because they want to be. Just my recommendation, anyone who's listening right now, that anyone who has been your mentor or could be your mentor, keep reaching out to them because it also helps them also. And just like I'm sure when you reach out to someone on your team and they feel like they can impact you in a positive way, probably makes their day.
Yeah, it was funny. I told you at the start, before we started recording, that I was hemming and hawing over doing this. And I spent a lot of time at the gym, and I was at the gym, and I'm the older side at the gym. I have a lot of younger friends there. And I was talking to a friend, a woman who's 30 maybe, runs her own business. And I was like, I'm just trying to decide whether to do this podcast or not. And she grabbed me and she says, you should do it. And I was like, why? And she said, you'd have a lot of good things to say. And she really built me up. And so I let it pass. And the next day I go to the gym and she said, did you make a decision? And it was she was really good at it. She wasn't just making me feel good, but she was actually holding me accountable. And I was like, no, I'm going to send the email tomorrow. And it took me a few days to get back to you. And you have Shannon Keating to thank that she's followed the next stage. She goes, did you make your decision? Because I'd really like to hear your podcast. And so I think there are unexpected mentors. And I think the more you expose yourself to different generations and different places, nowadays you find the most interesting kind of support outside the traditional channels that you used to get.
Well, first off, Shannon, when you listen to this, thank you. I was so thrilled when Nancy reached back out to me and said, all right, I'm in. Okay. So, I know the last, not 12 months, but 10 months, a lot has changed for you. All right.
Yep.
I know that you have grown your family with a furry member of the family who is upstairs
Yeah, I
here
have.
in your home right now. And that has become a passion of yours. But you've also talked to me a little bit about scuba diving. And
Yeah.
can you tell just, I'm super curious, what drew you into scuba diving and what makes you so passionate, like why you want to continue? I know that you've got trips on the docket. So.
Yep. Well, scuba diving is something I wanted to do well, let me get back up. So just to explain what's going on is that I left NIXON last October. I started working full time when I was 16 years old. And I took far few vacations, far too few leaves. I never took time off. And so I began to orchestrate my exit from full-time work a couple of years ago and made it happen. And happily, it's so hard to use the word retired. I don't think I'm really retired. I'm just moving into a new kind of advisory where I work less and play more. And scuba diving came up because it's something I've wanted to do since I was a kid. I actually took a subscription to the Scuba magazine when I was like 10 years old. And I love the water, and it was something I just never got around to. I was married for a long time, and my ex-husband didn't like the water. Someone else I dated for a long time didn't like the water. And I was growing tired of rowing. And so 2 years ago, I just said, I'm going to do it. And didn't start scuba diving until less than 2 years ago. And now I have about 75 dives under my belt. I love it. And I love it for a couple of reasons. Pretty busy, active people. People always say, I don't know how you're going to retire because you are on the go all the time. And I am still on the go all the time. I'm constantly processing. I'm constantly thinking. And that's probably my downfall. If you've scuba dived, what I'm talking about is that you put on the gear and you jump in the water and just everything goes silent. All you hear is your breathing. You can hear your regulator. As you go down deeper, there's pressure. So it's like a giant hug. And so you have this wonderful pressure and this wonderful silence. And as much as I love the outdoors, when you're in the woods, you see a bear way over there. Hopefully it's way over there. You see a squirrel way up in the tree. When you're in the water, you are literally swimming through nature. I mean, you have fish like swimming around your head. You have nurse sharks bumping into you. I actually love night diving because you can only see about this much. And like you can stare at piece of coral for 5 minutes and there's just so much going on there. And the sea is largely unexplored, and the sea has a lot to do with the planet's health. So I just feel probably the most in touch with nature ever scuba diving. So I am off to Honduras in 2 weeks and Thailand in January.
So 2 weeks. And then you're going to Rotan. Is that what you remember correctly? Yeah. Beautiful. I love that idea of going and like completely, it's a new environment. Everything's shut off. It's silent, right? I don't get the exact same experience when I surf, but what I do get is complete disconnection from any beeps, any notifications. Nothing is coming in. Maybe some conversation, which is not always, sometimes it's welcome.
I know it's very much like rowing also was a way for me to rest my brain because it's not like you have to think about strategy or rowing, but it's technical enough that you just fall into thinking about the rowing. And as soon as you get an outside thought in your head, you screw up. So you just learn to tune it out. But I think that's really important that you find those things. And then I'll tell you is that I know you love surfing, but I think you said you're starting up some new hobbies too. I'm a big believer that you should be, through life, you should be regularly stopping doing things and starting new things.
I am in that exact stage right now. I've become obsessed with trying to become a golfer.
Yep.
And I've got a little bit of addiction to pickleball now. And I owned paddles for 3 years and never used them. Right when the borders between Costa Rica and the US opened up, I bought some, brought them down here, never played. And now there's 4 courts in my town and I started playing them 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And I really look forward to it. And the community. I feel like I've made new friends. I engage with people in a unique way.
New friends. And it's humbling. Learning something new is really humbling. And I think that's how you can build empathy, whether it's a sport or a language or art. As you get older and you become an expert in more and more things, I think doing new things yourself makes you realize, what does it feel like? What does it feel like to walk into a gym and you don't know anyone? What does it feel like to not be good at something? What does it feel like not to be good at golf? And other people are good at golf. And I think it keeps you grounded that way.
Yeah. Well, here's to finding things for everyone that's listening on being more grounded. So as we conclude, Nancy, thank you so much. It has been an absolute pleasure to host you today. I'd like to leave anyone who's still listening just a quick thought, and that is today, be kind to everyone that you meet. We never know what other people are going through, and always try to even be extra special kind to yourself today, and enjoy your day.